Hi again then guys, and welcome to episode 14 of Days Gone By, the review series for Gran Turismo's selection of classic cars. And on Gran Turismo there have always been a pretty strong selection of Japanese classics, and on GT6 we have quite a few classic variations of the Skyline. There are a lot of Skylines on the game of course, and a few of those, not as many of the new ones, but a few of them are the classic Skyline. Now I personally find this particular Skyline to be interesting because it's not necessarily as powerful as you might expect it to be. In the dealerships there are two primary versions of the classic GT-R style Skyline. You've got this version, which is the GC110 Skyline, and you've got the more famous and more obvious choice of the HT2000 GT-R, which was of course very successful in racing. That version looks as though it's going to be the lighter and more handling focused of the two, whereas this car, the GC110, in my opinion at least, looks kind of like a classic muscle car. A little bit smaller of course, but it has that classic muscle kind of shape to it. It's a bigger car, it's a heavier car, it's a more expensive car, and I would have personally expected it to be the more powerful of the two as well, but it's not, and that's mainly due to the fact that it's not allowed to be. The HT2000 model can be turbocharged to have significantly more power than this car. Now we will feature that model in another episode, but for now we have this version to consider. It's naturally aspirated, and that's a shame, because if it had more power it would be even more effective. As it stands, the 2-litre engine puts out 281 horsepower and 203 foot-pounds of torque, so no way near what it should be capable of. Thankfully though, despite being larger than the other Skyline and looking probably what you'd expect to be a bit heavier than some other Japanese classics, it's actually not heavy at all. It weighs 958 kilos with a full weight loss package, and that's pretty decent given the look and size of the car. Horsepower per tonne isn't too bad because the weight is a lot lower than a tonne. 293 horsepower per tonne is the exact number, and the PP is actually very good. It's not too high at all. 458 PP is actually very reasonable, and I would say is exactly where this car deserves to be, because at the 450 PP level, this is one of those cars which I would strongly recommend you bear in mind. If you were ever to need a 450 PP vehicle, or potentially lower, this is a good one to go for, not necessarily in all situations, but certainly in some. Now as far as price, it's reasonably expensive at 85 grand, that's 5 grand more than the HT2000 model, but I actually prefer this car of the two. I think it's a far better looking machine. It's also rarer than the HT2000, hardly any were built in comparison to most of the other Skylines, and I think it's just a cooler car with that kind of muscle car vibe that it has. As you can probably see in the video, you can also remove the ducktail spoiler from the boot, which is an interesting thing to know about a classic. There aren't many which have modifiable bodywork, especially non-premiums, which is what this car is. And overall the performance is actually very good. It's not supercar level of course, but given the fact that it's not allowed a turbo or supercharger, it works with what it's given very well. Admirably, in fact. The handling is very good, it's very easy to drive because you've got hardly any torque and power to deal with, and the fact that it has a low amount of weight in the car that's actually a decent size means that it feels quite nimble, but not necessarily twitchy, because some small ultra lightweight cars can have a tendency to feel a little bit twitchy, a little bit flighty, as though if you take a curb wrong you'll just flip the car over. This doesn't feel like that at all. It has a groundedness to the steering, to the handling, but it is still lightweight, so even though it doesn't have a huge amount of power, the handling is very good and the performance is very good given that power. And the fact that it's at such a low PP means that it's actually more usable than you might think, because once you get into the ultra low PP level of racing, say 450 PP or less, the options to go for can sometimes become a bit more vague, because everybody races at like 500 PP or higher, but relatively few people spend a lot of time racing at lower PP levels. There are certainly some people who do, but not as many as who race in the higher PP levels. So when you go down to those levels, say for seasonal events in particular, or maybe the odd online lobby, what do you choose? Because there are certainly cars there, but how do you know which one's a good one to go for? Well, I'm not necessarily claiming that this is the best possible car you could go for a lower PP, but it is a good car to bear in mind, not just because the PP is low, but also because it's a classic. And there aren't many really genuinely good low PP classic race cars. Even my personal favourite version of the Skyline, the classic BLRA3 Prince Skyline, is not that great at its PP. It's not bad, it's just not overly quick, whereas this car actually does feel quick for its power and for its PP. So although it's not necessarily the best thing ever, it's not necessarily going to blow your mind or anything like that, it's a car which is slightly underused by many people, but one which you should definitely bear in mind, especially for lower PP racing. And it allows you to do it in a classic with a lot of class, and it's also obscure, which in my opinion just adds to the cool factor. But that's it overall for this particular episode. I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.